Strengthening Non-Proliferation, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. In a 2009 speech in Prague, President Obama confirmed the U.S. commitment to bring about a world without nuclear weapons. This vision rests on progress in three areas: disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful use of nuclear technology. Those charged with achieving these goals face considerable obstacles. Nuclear hawks question the advisability of disarmament. Others support the vision, but question whether it's achievable. For an insider's view of the Obama administration's efforts to rid the world of the nuclear threat, we're pleased to be joined by Ambassador Susan Burke. Ambassador Burke was sworn in as Special Representative of the President for Nuclear Nonproliferation in June of 2009. She's responsible for working with other nations to strengthen the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and the International Nonproliferation Regime. She previously served as the first Deputy Coordinator for Homeland Security in the State Department's Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism and as Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Nonproliferation. Ambassador Burke, welcome to International Focus.
I'm glad to be here, Doug. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I'd like to start with some basics. From a practitioner's perspective, let's look at a few definitions. What do we mean by nonproliferation?
Well, I think it means what it says. What we're trying to do is prevent the further spread of weapons of mass destruction. We talk about nuclear nonproliferation. That's sort of the key. But we're really talking about the prevention of all weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, biological.
And disarmament?
Disarmament, that's the other side of it. It's when you're getting rid of the weapons that you have. It's not preventing them from being there in the first place, but it's reducing the numbers, eventually eliminating the numbers of weapons that you have in your stockpiles.
And from policy perspective, how do they really interact?
Well, where they really come together is in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and we can talk about that. When the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty was negotiated in the late 60s, there was a basic bargain, and President Obama reiterated the basic bargain in Prague, and he called it sound. And that was that the states at that time that had nuclear weapons would pursue nuclear disarmament, i.e., they would pursue measures to get rid of them. And the countries that didn't have nuclear weapons would commit not to acquire them, the non-proliferation piece of this. And then the third pillar of the treaty, as we call it, was that all states would be able to benefit from the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So that's where you see disarmament and non-proliferation coming together in a complementary fashion.
And I would think you would have a much stronger case for non-proliferation if you're working the disarmament side. I mean, how would you respond to the argument a state might make, credibly, of, well, you have them, why can't we?
Well, I think that's a case that some states attempt to make, and I think President Obama has made it clear that we need to make good faith efforts to move in the direction of disarmament and to a world without nuclear weapons, the vision that he sketched out in Prague. And we are trying to do that, working with the Russians in the first instance to reduce our respective stockpiles with the New START agreement to the lowest levels that we've had since the 1950s. So that's a pretty significant accomplishment. And to demonstrate by our own good faith efforts our commitment to the treaty, but to ask others to meet their responsibilities, which are to strengthen the non-proliferation regime and take steps to ensure that these weapons don't spread to other regions of the world.
And it's still a remarkably small club, thankfully, of nuclear armed states. So when we talk about the U.S. and Russia, what percentage of the total?
I think senior officials have said that between the U.S. and Russia, it's about 90%, a little bit more, of the total number of nuclear weapons in the world. So that's we have the largest responsibility at this point.
And let's just remind our audience of the other members of the club. We've got China, and could you just comment a little bit on from the U.S. perspective, what their posture is at this point?
Well, I would say there are 5 countries that have nuclear weapons that are acknowledged, if you will, within the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. That is, they had nuclear weapons at the time the treaty was signed and entered into force. And those are the United States, Russia, China, as you mentioned, France, and the United Kingdom. The last 3 all have much smaller stockpiles than the U.S. and Russia. But they do have a commitment under the NPT to pursue disarmament. And the president in Prague, again, made it clear that once the U.S. and Russians had brought their stockpiles down to lower levels, that he looked forward to multilateralizing and bringing in other states into this negotiation so that we could negotiate disarmament with all of the states.
So to date, there hasn't been any negotiated disarmament by the other states?
No, not anything like what the U.S. and Russia have done. What we will do, and what will happen this summer, is the P5, as we call them, the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states, will be meeting in Paris at French invitation to begin or to continue a conversation about verification, transparency, and confidence-building measures. This is something that we all agreed to do at the NPT Review Conference. This is a conference of the parties in May of last year. And so the 5 will get together. This is pretty unusual. We haven't gotten together to have these kinds of discussions routinely, and we're looking to do this on a more regular basis so that we have a better understanding of each other's views and policies and can really move towards greater confidence.
And what about the non-NPT states? Who's in that list?
Well, we have 3 states that have never signed the treaty. That's India and Pakistan, both who are publicly have demonstrated that they have nuclear weapons. Israel has never signed the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And North Korea was a party for a number of years, but then announced it was withdrawing and has since tested a nuclear explosive device and has declared that it has a nuclear weapons capabilities as well. So 4 states outside of the regime.
So why don't we talk a little further about the sort of background that led up to the NPT?
Well, as I look at it from the history, I wasn't there when it was negotiated, but I actually did work with some of the negotiators later in their careers and early in mine. There was a sense that there were 5 nuclear weapon states. It was a cascade effect. Each country had developed nuclear weapons because another country had. And as I read the history, the international community just decided enough was enough, and they wanted to cap that, and they wanted to bring all the states in the world together to agree not to proliferate further and get a commitment from the 5 that had nuclear weapons to get rid of them. The treaty's been remarkably successful. Has it been perfect? No, it hasn't. Has it prevented some states from acquiring nuclear weapons? No. But when you look at predictions that were made at early in the 60s by President Kennedy, he talked about a world of 15 to 20 nuclear weapon states. Many in this business believe that very well could have been the case, or even more, without the structure of this legal framework and this legal non-proliferation norm that in fact has really taken hold globally.
So what was the incentive for states after the fact to join? I mean, if I would like to have the biggest stick in my neighborhood, why would I want to join?
Well, that's a great question. I think it would probably vary from state to state, from region to region. In some cases, states saw this as an opportunity to position themselves to access the benefits of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and they saw that as an important contribution. Others did it because in their neighborhood it just was the thing to do. I mean, in a way, it's a way for states to reassure each other close by that they're not acquiring nuclear weapons. And then some others saw it as a way to put pressure on states in their region to join, or to put pressure on the 5 nuclear weapon states to disarm. So I think the motivations varied, but in the end, we're now with 189 countries that are party. We have long supported universal adherence to the NPT. We're not quite there, but we're pretty darn close.
And what's the relationship? You touched on peaceful use of nuclear energy and the NPT.
Well, Article 4 of the NPT provides that all states will facilitate the fullest possible access of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, with a specific attention to developing countries, and that was the way the article was drawn back in the 60s. This is an area that, in my opinion, is not as well appreciated, and I think we've gotten to a point now, 40 years. We just had the 41st birthday of the NPT on Saturday. The nuclear energy for peaceful purposes is so widely used, whether it's for X-rays or cancer therapy, industry, agriculture, a number of different very benign uses. I don't know that many countries realize anymore that this is all part of the Atoms for Peace, what we're calling Atoms for Development, the basic bargain. It's just so commonplace now. We can do more, I think, to raise the profile of in fact, the benefits that countries are getting. And now there's renewed enthusiasm, whether you're for it or against it, it is a fact, on the part of many countries to look at nuclear power in the future as a green response, if you will, to concerns about climate change and also to concerns about energy security, which I think we can all, appreciate right now. And so many countries are beginning to look at pursuing nuclear power in the future as a way of generating electricity. If, in fact, this materializes in the next 20, 50, 100 years, we're going to have to do that in a way that is safe and secure and doesn't promote non-proliferation. So there's a whole new dimension now of the power dimension. But what we've all been taking advantage of and benefiting from for the last 50 years is the non-power applications of nuclear energy.
And if I, as a state, am outside the NPT, what do I give up?
Well, it depends. For many, many years, the U.S. has had a policy of according what we call preference to NPT parties. When we decide how to allocate our resources or our technical assistance, it has been to NPT parties in the first instance, and that continues to be the case. So as a party to the treaty, you should be able to benefit from that kind of assistance.
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the threats that the NPT and your work in general really addresses. And so let's talk about the kinds of things that you and your office is worried about, starting with nuclear weapons from non-state actor. I mean, is that something that's really risen on the list of threats in the last several years?
Well, I think people are concerned about non-state actors or terrorist groups acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. There's lots of evidence that certain groups, Al-Qaeda and others, would like to acquire that capability. There's no evidence that they have. And that's the good news. I think knowing that that's a concern and a threat then allows us to focus our efforts on trying to secure our nuclear materials and other technologies so that they can't acquire that. But that's become the new threat, the threat of nuclear terrorism. And
how does that compare to sort of the sort of 50s era threat of use by a belligerent state? I mean, is that less of a real world concern at this point?
I think as you look at the concerns about the potential threat from terrorist groups or non-state actors, it is a much more serious threat because it would be harder to determine where the attack came from in that case. I mean, we see that with conventional terrorism. So it's a much more complicated matter. If a terrorist were to use a nuclear weapon or a nuclear device, where would you go? Who would you retaliate against? It's much harder. And I think in the old Cold War days, it was simpler. It was dangerous, but it was simpler. Now it's much more complicated, which is the reason why the U.S. is working with a lot of foreign partners to try to get a handle on materials, technologies, to keep them out of the hands of groups like this that would intend to do harm.
Great. Well, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about non-proliferation with Ambassador Susan Burke. Well, before the break, we were talking about that balance on sort of the threat scale between terrorist group, non-state actor versus sort of the old Cold War model of, the state-sponsored nuclear attack. What about acquisition of nuclear weapons by new states? And that's certainly something we see a lot in the headline. How much of Your work is involved in that sort of thing, you say.
Well, that is really a big concern for a couple of reasons. One, if states in particularly in volatile regions acquire nuclear weapons capability, it can only make that situation worse and make it more volatile. And we see in a situation, India and Pakistan, these are two countries that have been at war. That's a concern, although we're working with both of them. North Korea with nuclear weapons, threatening South Korea, provocative actions, belligerent actions, clearly that ups the ante in that region. And then with states that we're concerned about or we believe are interested in pursuing nuclear weapons, it makes this regional situations much more complicated. So on the regional level, it's a problem. On a global level, as states acquire nuclear weapons, it will make it much more difficult for the states that have the nuclear weapons to get down to the low numbers and eventually to zero. And I think what we're trying to do is to promote a non-proliferation norm where the countries are firmly abiding by their non-proliferation commitments and creating conditions that will make it possible for the states that have nuclear weapons to bring those levels down eventually to zero. So it works adversely in two ways.
Well, and that brings us to another potential threat, I would think, just the corrosive effect of people who are signatories but are non-compliant.
Well, I think, corrosive is exactly the word to use. We have a case with the NPT. Iran found in violation of the treaty. North Korea announces it's withdrawing and then clearly engaging in activities that are flagrantly in violation. This really undermines the integrity of the treaty. It's important to remember that with those few exceptions, and there are some questions about Syria's program right now that the international community is addressing in the International Atomic Energy Agency, but with those few exceptions, all the other parties to the treaty are abiding by their commitments, and they are trying to in good faith, meet their responsibilities. But it only takes a few to cast doubt and to lead their regional neighbors to question the whole operation. Well,
let's talk a little bit about the three-part strategy of reducing, securing, and preventing. And one leg of that stool, reducing, was in the news this past year with the ratification of the New START Treaty. You can talk a little bit about the significance of that.
Well, the New START Treaty was really significant because it's the first fully negotiated treaty with a strong verification regime that we have been able to accomplish with the Russians in a number of years. And it restored the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, put it back on a good footing. And I think that in and of itself is important. It also represented reductions that will lead us to the lowest numbers since the 1950s, and so that's important. It's a significant accomplishment in terms of disarmament. The verification regime will be very helpful to confidence between the two countries, and the treaty is in force and it is being implemented now, and there are various milestones. You can find them on the State Department website on when the verification visits will start and exchanges of information. So we're well on our way. It's also important because it now opens the way for the next round of negotiations, and President Obama and other senior officials have made it clear publicly that we would like to see that next negotiation include non-deployed and non-strategic weapons. So we're really beginning to get to important systems that will.
So could you just give us a little background on what that means?
Well, I think what we're talking about is non-strategic systems. These are systems that are not, ICBMs, intercontinental. These are systems that are more used in a battlefield situation. And I won't get into too much detail on that, but that's an issue, I think, that is going to make the next round of negotiations much more complicated. But it is something we're on the record of seeking in the next negotiation. So this is important. And as the President said in Prague, once the U.S. and the Russians have brought their forces down to much lower levels, then it'll be the time to include other states in a negotiation, because that's the only way we'll get to zero. This is all going to take a lot of time. And as I describe it, I need to say this is very difficult. In many cases, it's rocket science. It's going to take a lot of patience and persistence. It's not going to happen quickly. I think when you look at the New START treaty that was signed and is now in force, it was negotiated in record time as these things go. Typically, the SALT treaties in the past, they took years and years and years. This one was completed in a single year and then brought into force in another 6 months. So we need to be very realistic about the timelines for the next phase of negotiation. But it's a way of demonstrating our seriousness and our commitment to the disarmament objectives of the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Well, I will unfairly ask you as a diplomat to do something no diplomat wants to do, and that's talk a little bit about the domestic aspect of all of this. When we talk about negotiating the treaty, there's negotiations with the Russians, but there's also a fair amount of negotiation in terms of congressional objection. What would someone who was a little bit more skeptical of this treaty have raised as a concern?
Well, I'm trying to think. Not having been involved in the negotiations, I'm thinking of what we just saw from press descriptions on this, and there were concerns expressed about the existing nuclear weapons. I would mention the nuclear posture review that the administration put out almost a year ago. In that, it described a number of different elements of the new nuclear posture, but it made it clear that as long as nuclear weapons existed, and President Obama said this in Prague, the United States will have to maintain a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent. A number of the questions that were raised in the face of the New START agreement were, can you assure us that we are maintaining a safe, secure, and reliable nuclear deterrent? And that goes to the issue of the nuclear labs, the DOE labs, and the technology that we have to ensure that the stockpile that remains is safe, secure, and reliable. So those were the kinds of questions. My understanding is that the administration fielded over 1,000 questions for the record, and they answered every one. And I know in the State Department these things usually have to be turned around on a 24-hour notice. So there was a real effort to be very responsive to all the questions, 1,000 questions that came in, and I'm assuming that they covered every aspect of the treaty and of relations with various states.
And what about arguably one of the quid pro quo elements of this domestically was not totally closing the door on missile defense. How does the notion of missile defense fit into non-proliferation and disarmament?
Well, the missile defense point, the administration made it clear repeatedly and continues to make it clear that there is nothing in the treaty that would in any way constrain U.S. missile defense options. And the debate cycled around on that, and I think there were some concerns, perhaps, that was the case. But from the negotiators, it was very clear there was no restrictions, no infringement of U.S. missile defense activities. And what we're trying to do now is pursue missile defense cooperation within NATO, but with Russia as well. So I think that's been, that is very clear, and I can't add anything to that.
Well, I'd like to give you a opportunity to sort of reflect on. We've had basically about 6 decades of nuclear policy right now. How do you think your boss's administration has departed or been consistent with his predecessors in terms of the U.S. nuclear policy?
Well, that's sort of a tough question to answer. I've been working on these issues for almost 35 years. Have spent most of my time doing non-proliferation, and it's an area which, for the most part, has enjoyed strong bipartisan support. Everybody can agree that the spread of nuclear weapons would not be a good thing, and most agree that there are certain institutional elements and legal frameworks that we need to use to advance our non-proliferation agenda. The difference, I think, with this administration, and one of the reasons why I'm so privileged to be able to serve in this position, is they've embraced this notion of this 3 pillars: the disarmament, non-proliferation, nuclear security, but they've also embraced multilateralism. They've embraced the idea that it is not up to the U.S. alone, and I think the President at the United Nations in 2009 gave a wonderful speech where he talked about the U.S. is willing to lead, but we cannot do it alone. And I think that call to the international community to step up and meet its responsibilities is very important. My own view is that these issues have gotten so complicated over the years that they are only going to be solved by a collective group, that the U.S. cannot solve these challenges by itself. There's no single state or single group of states anymore that can solve these global problems. It's going to take the political will and the energetic efforts of a broad swath of the international community. And this administration has made it very clear that it is seeking to partner with the international community to try to grapple with these challenges. And it's not just nuclear proliferation or nuclear security, it's the environment, it's pandemic health, it's the economy. And I think that approach to the issues of requiring a collective effort to solve it, and a multilateral effort is something that I really appreciate, and I'm happy to be able to contribute in a small way.
Well, on behalf of humanity, thank you very much for your efforts. Ambassador Susan Burke, thank you for being with us. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,